Welcome to the Mile High Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Daniel Knowles. Thank you for joining us. And if you're a fan of Tick, then you're a fan of Mile High Tick, and you want to make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss any Mile High Tick, and certainly that you are at Mile High in September 23rd weekend. We look forward to seeing you on higher ground. Today, I am super thrilled, and you will be too, to connect with who we are interviewing. Dr. Ian Bulow is a 2008 graduate of Palmer College of Chiropractic. He owns Revive Upper Cervical Chiropractic Clinic in PA, Pittsburgh, PA, one of my favorite areas. Where my wife's from. UCC is one of the nation's premier upper cervical clinics. He is a president of the ICA's Council on Upper Cervical Care. He's an advanced instructor of the Blair Society. And Blair approach is not something that many people learn, unfortunately. So we're really grateful to be sharing about that today, and also sharing about that at Mile High, where he'll be presenting as well as doing not only a mainstay session, but also a breakout session. So Dr. Ian, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Doc. It's awesome being here, being with your community. I can't wait. Can't wait to get started today and seeing everybody in the fall. It's going to be great.
It will be. And I'm really grateful that you'll be sharing some information about the upper cervical spine. And tell me how did you find, well, actually, let's get to know you first. How did you find your way into chiropractic, period?
Sure. There's so much, and I love chiropractic, and I love the community because everyone's got such unique and amazing stories. Mine's probably like a lot of people. I had a car accident, had an injury, saw a chiropractor, got better. But actually something that might be unique is what pushed me over the edge was I was having lunch on a weekday at a friend's house, and I was homeschooled growing up. So a weekday, normally you'd be in school, but we had a homeschooling co-op, and we went over to my friend's house, and long story short is their dad was a chiropractor, and he came home for lunch. And it really kind of rocked me, because I had been helped, like a lot of us have been helped. But here was a family that had great relational dynamics in the family. Their kids were really healthy. They had a nice home, and their dad came home for lunch. And I thought, man, I can help people, and I can have a good work-life balance and all of that. And that's something that's really near and dear to my heart, is having balance in all things in your life. And so it really just spoke to me. And that's where the journey started, and we can always talk about where we go from there. But that's what got me into it. I got help from a chiropractor, and it seemed to be a good lifestyle.
And those two things tend to attract a lot of people. Similar things. And then, how did you find your way to focusing? What drew you to specializing in upper cervical chiropractic?
Yeah. So. Great question. So I went to Palmer, Maine, and but I didn't have a lot of, like most students, appreciation of chiropractic philosophy or this or that or the other, right? I just knew that Palmer was kind of like the birthplace of the profession, so I thought that would be kind of cool to go there. About a year in, I at Palmer in fourth trimester, which is the first class of the second year of schooling, we had toggle recoil. And honestly, I went into it thinking it was just some dogmatic technique that Palmer had to teach because that quack BJ did it, and it was the crazy guy with the crazy hair who killed his dad, right? And I mean, that's what, even at Palmer, that's the brand value sometimes, which is ridiculous, of course.
Right.
And I can feel myself getting excited here because it drives me crazy. But anyhow, so I thought, why would you focus on two bones when you can focus on all of them, right? It just seemed dogmatic. It didn't seem to make any sense at all. And during that semester, I also was introduced to the Delta Sigma Chi fraternity. So shout out to all the Delts out there. And whenever the Delts are one of those organizations, sort of like Mile High, sort of like a lot of organizations that are very principled. So when you're going through and you start understanding the principles of chiropractic, you start realizing why neurology is important. And if you're paying attention to neurology, you start realizing why the upper cervical area is important. So the pieces started connecting with me at that point. And also around the same time, I was a part of the Gonstead Club for a while, and I liked the analytics. Like, it just fit my brain, like all the measurements and all the kind of like tests and having everything measured. And so I look at like chiropractic, like, the family tree of D.D. Palmer is very tonal, very, energy based, all that kind of stuff, where the BJ lineage is, and that includes Gonstead, by the way, is very, I don't want to say analytical because it sounds like I'm disparaging the tonal work, but it's not that. But it's kind of more, I don't know if the word's Newtonian or whatever, but you're just measuring things with rulers and all that kind of stuff, right? So God said kind of resonated with me. And then somewhere in the fray there, it was time for electives. I asked my big brother in the fraternity, what I should do. You could take like Pedabon or Activator or Blair or this or that. And he said, did you like Toggle? And I said, well, yeah, because Toggle was that way. Everything's measured, everything's calculated. I liked all that. And he goes, you should try Blair. And I said, why? And he goes, well, it's kind of a badass toggle. I said, all right, I'll try Blair out, And so I got into the Blair work, which we can talk about. And I just want to give credit to one other piece of the puzzle in that journey of like principle and figuring techniques. The secret sauce that I think convicts us all are results, right? So we kind of have our technique that feels right to us. We have our educated background and what we've learned in research. And then there's that emotional payoff of results, right? That's what gets a lot of us into the profession. And what kind of like steered me towards upper cervical was a lot of the analytics that I call the analytics, but it may, we can use a different word for that. I can't figure it out now. But and then there was a guy named James Tomasi who came and spoke at my school. And James was a guy who had trigeminal neuralgia, which most of us probably know is nicknamed the suicide disease because it's just a debilitating thing. And here's a guy who's in his 60s who literally had his life saved. He had come to the decision that he was going to kill himself on a Tuesday afternoon when his wife was picking up their kids from school. And like most TN patients, he had all of his teeth pulled. He had been to neurologists. He had been to chiropractic. He tried chiropractic. He'd done acupuncture. He'd done everything. And his wife came home on a Friday from shopping all excited. She said, hey, there was a doctor on the radio and we scheduled you an appointment. They said they might be able to help. He said, fine. It's for Tuesday next week. And his question to her, because he had planned on killing himself on Tuesday, was what time on Tuesday? Because he had to like figure it out. Like, is it going to interrupt my plan to kill myself? Because he had already made that decision. And what really rocked me about James was that it was the first time someone talked about suicide, not as an act of desperation, but there was like this eerie, calming spirit of like control. Like it was okay. Like he had found a solution. I even get chills now thinking about it. He had found a solution where no one else had found a solution. And it was not a bad thing. He was okay with it. He was totally fine. He kind of felt bad that his wife would have to deal with people judging her for her husband committing suicide, So anyhow, she said, it's Tuesday morning. He said, great. He goes, who is it? What is it? She said, well, it's a chiropractor. And he kind of like, okay, we've done that before. And it just so happened to be a NUCA doc. And I don't even do NUCA, but it was an upper cervical technique that kind of set things right in a different way. And that intrigued me. And the other thing was just the emotional payoff. He would stop while he was talking like this to students. And you'll appreciate this from just a loving spirit. He would stop and just say, have I told you guys I love you yet? Like he would literally say that to chiropractic students. You know what I mean? And he was like, we need you. We need you. And that like floored me. I'm like, who is this guy that I don't even know saying that he loves me and that he needs us? Like, I'm like, I couldn't even comprehend that as a student. I'm like, what is going on with this chiropractic thing, And so that was all happening at the same time. And it just so happened to be in an upper cervical world that was all kind of the pieces were fitting. But as we all know, that can happen in any kind of a technique. When it's done at the right time, the right way, we're going to see the miracle that is innate intelligence and the capacity of the human body. But it just all clicked for me. And because of that, the path was just kind of set, you know what I mean? And then it just went from there.
That's very, very cool. And I have a tremendous admiration and love for upper cervical work overall. As Sherman, it was the focus of our education, and learning from Perry Rush, who I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And took Blair programs, and really the whole essence of the upper cervical analysis and pattern analysis was the basis of the education. And also that's the network. I do network, as you know. Network is completely based on upper cervical model and analysis and principles. And my dad's my dad's mentor, I mean, he started out as an upper cervical practitioner in practice, and so a network grew out of an upper cervical mindset. So the principles that are foundational to me, I think they're very important, especially pattern analysis and the body being dynamic, which is all of that. So I really get fascinated by it. So I loved discussing this area of chiropractic, particularly and analysis. So with that, what I'd like to ask is there something that you'd like to share about the upper cervical spine that maybe people don't know that you think is fascinating?
Oh man, there's so much. But I do have a couple things that I think the first thing that you talked about, well, we could probably talk about that more at Mile High in terms of the analysis. I think that's a big part of it. And it reminds me of the truism of how you do one thing is how you do everything, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you're specific in one area, you should be specific in all areas. And just that carrying that through. And we'll probably talk more about types of analyses and how you can apply that in a full spine model and things like that at Mile High. But I will say one thing, and I have to give a nod to the Upper Cervical Diplomate Program, which maybe we'll talk about at some point. But one of the things that I even learned, right? So you graduate, well-rounded chiropractor, that sort of thing, specialize in your technique, kind of get some mastery. And that for me, that was Blair. And then the diplomates, and there's different diplomates in chiropractic, obviously, but the Upper Cervical Diplomate, it dives even deeper into this craniocervical junction area. And the one thing that I think is important, one concept that I kind of come to appreciate was that, especially in the upper cervical area, is it's not, if the bone was stuck, you wouldn't be able to do this, right? There's so much mobility in the upper cervical spine that my understanding of the subluxation complex went from being, it is stuck here and we have to unstick it and move it over here, to more being that it is an aberrant, abnormal kind of range of motion in this direction, and we need to bring it back to its neutral, more aligned range of motion, right? And when you look at it, and it's one of the reasons that BJ was so obsessed with it, is that you don't have all those bony locks that you have in all the other places. And the only thing that really holds the CCJ together, and sometimes we'll even talk about this with patients, I'll show them the atlas and the axis, and depending on the patient, I might tell them, the only thing stopping you from doing a 360-degree rotation like that horror movie Carrie, that's why it depends on the patient, is ligaments, right? I mean, you're held together like saran wrap, wrapped around all these bones, right? And to take a page from Dr. Brooks is Taking Care of People, accidents and injuries throughout our life tear loose the connective tissue that holds the spine together. And there's no more evident an area than that than the upper cervical region. So I now look at the subluxation of the craniocervical junction a little bit more like looking at a sprained ankle, you know what I mean? Like, it is a very mobile joint that gets damaged and dislodges and subluxates. And our job is to almost like guide it, mentor it, correct it, adjust it, help the body stabilize it. And like chiropractic, maintain it subluxation free over the duration of their life. But it's not like it's just in position A, stuck there. It's more of this aberrant fixation that then creates a subluxation. But it's not like glue. It's not like you have like super glue tacked in and the atlas is there. It's like, just take a video fluoroscopy, you'll see it move. It just doesn't move well. You know what I mean? So it's kind of expanding that concept from a stuck plain film x-ray of like, it's here. It's like, well, it's there now, but if you were to take a video fluoro, you'd see it moving around. It's not like glued to the occiput stuck, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, I think that was a big kind of learning curve jump in the Diplomate Program. And then that just changes things. Like, how you apply that in your world is how you apply it. It's just science. It's just how things are. But that for me, I think, is an important thing to look at. And by the way, I will say, I think that also then speaks to BJ's concept of holding is healing and not over adjusting a patient, right? Because if our job is to correct it only when necessary, and if it is this dynamic moving phenomena, then over adjusting would absolutely destabilize that area, especially in the upper cervical. You know what I mean? And especially with a powerful technique, right? If you've got some really dynamic osseous adjusting protocols, you absolutely are making osseous changes in a good way, but then overdone, you have to realize there's a double edge to that sword that can then destabilize it in a not so good way. right? We've got to respect the adjustment and the power that it has. And if it's as powerful as we say it is, then done at the wrong time or in the wrong way, why can't we cause subluxations, right? Like, so I think that concept, and I'll end it at that because I know I could keep on rolling. But to me, I think that's important. I think it's important for new grads. I think it's important for chiropractors in general, just to revere and respect and understand kind of what we're dealing with. And the upper cervical area, just to me, kind of like puts all those concepts under a magnifying glass, just because it is such a movable, sensitive area.
Right. And a little diving a little bit more deeper in Blair, okay, and Blair analysis. And I took introductory Blair courses. If I remember right, wow, this is going back a lot of years, so I may not remember. I think it was Munson. Is that the right name?
Muncie.
Yes, that's who I took courses with way back when. Yep.
Yeah.
And really enjoyed and learned so much from him. He was such an incredible person. There's 2 3-dimensional things I want to ask. This is the first one. So help people understand more about the 3-dimensional aspect to the X-rays and to and stereographic films and 3-dimensional torque. Can you say a little bit about those?
Absolutely, it's a great question. It's a little bit of a loaded one, but we'll see what we can do.
Okay.
So traditionally, right, we look at the human body from, and I don't know where this came from, but I mean, it comes from anatomy, it comes from a few things, but we look at it from A to P, lateral, and I to S, right? And the Cartesian coordinate system, we look at it chiropractically in all 3 planes. But the reality is, when you look at like an atlas, right, and you look at the superior articular surfaces of the atlas, they're not actually parallel like the yellow lines on a street, right? And I shouldn't have to say that to chiropractic. I'm just used to saying this to the lay people. Of course, they know what parallel is. So they're not parallel, right? They converge towards the anterior like an arrowhead. And so in the beginning, Bill Blair, well, actually it was BJ Palmer, would take oblique nasiums, right? So when we talk about 3-dimensional analysis, we could talk about current day, which is we're actually doing 3-dimensional CT scanning, which is pretty incredible. And we'll go over that at Mile High. But in concept, what Blair found was that, let's say you have a right atlas, right? The atlas rides up on the condyles on the right-hand side. And this is a mirrored image here, so I don't know if it's right or left. But in your own body right now, you imagine your atlas goes to the right. You would think that on the right side, the right AO joint would be sheared on that side, right? And you would think the left AO joint would also be sheared. But what Blair found was that wasn't really the case. It was, if you have these 2 tracks, right, these 2 articular surfaces of the atlas sucked up against the condyles, one of them typically will roll on the condyle in its oblique track, while the other one kind of goes off its track, right? And so my point is, because they're angled in like that, the only way to really see that is to take an oblique X-ray to look down the long axis of each condyle, right? So if each condyle turned in and then we look at it straight on, you're not really going to see the track. You know what I mean? It's like looking at a train track from the side versus looking down the long rail of the train track. If I look down the long rail of it, I can see if the train's off the track. If I look at it from the side, I can't really tell because I'm looking at it tangentially, right? So the analysis, and I know we're getting really into the weeds here, but the 3D analysis, number 1, is looking at it in 3D, looking at it not just A to P, not just lateral, not just top to down, because the joints aren't A to P. They're not just lateral. They're not just top to down. The joints are uniquely formed. So we customize our X-rays to look at the joint, right? Now, I probably should have ended with that because what I'm going to now go to is what you said, the 3D torque and understanding that. I love this topic because it's one of the topics that BJ talked about. And it's almost like the Bible. Like you read through things and the first time you see it, you're kind of like, oh, okay, that's like kindergarten. Like, I get that. It torques, meaning it misaligns, whatever. But then the more you look back at it, you realize like, holy crap, it really torques and twists and does things in 3D. It's not like the atlas goes lateral, forward, and rotates. Like people learn like ASRA, PIL. AIRP. Like, it doesn't work that way. And so when you actually look at it in Blair, we have people hold their hands on their lap like this. And if you angle your fingers in, that's the convergence angles, right? That's the tracks that we were just talking about, right? Your thumbs are either flat against the ground, or they're flat up or they're straight up towards the ceiling. That's what we call the slope angle. And believe me, I got huge slope angles. So mine are really high walls of the atlas. So there's no way that atlas is going straight lateral, right? Then you have the cupping. If you take your hands and you cup it like you're holding water on your hand, you can either have a shallow cup like a dinner plate, or you can have a really deep one like a chili bowl, right? And depending on how flat or deep the convexity is of the condyle will be how that atlas rolls, how it rocks. So you have three things to consider. You have the convergence angle, you have the slope angle, and then you have this cupping. And those three things will dictate, almost like a race car on a NASCAR track, the direction the atlas goes when it moves, right? So everybody has unique angles. Those three angles are unique in everybody, and they're independent on each side. And they will determine the torquing and twisting and linear direction of the atlas. And I just think that's really cool, because when BJ talks about it being like a torque twist misalignment, that we have to uncork or untorque, the torque, the way BJ writes things, is he's right. You know what I mean? It is a corkscrew misalignment that needs to be uncorked, right? And you can do that different ways. And I think it matters for a few reasons. I think that people, when we talk about technique, which again, I love the fact that you're theming this upcoming Mile High on technique, because it matters because of the things that we say as chiropractors, right? So if we say that the atlas has gone right, I'm going to ask you to validate that, right? And because you're talking about a linear thing, you're talking about a directional word, right? Right, left, front, back, clockwise, counterclockwise. Now, if you're talking about tonal, I have no idea, right? That's not my world, and I can't wait to learn. But when we're talking about linear displacement of vertebra relative to other vertebra, right? The definition of subluxation there on a segmental level, then this stuff matters, right? Because, by the way, real quick, and then we can close this one down, but the convergence angles, watch this. If you have perfectly parallel condyles, it doesn't exist in nature, but let's just say you do, and that atlas tracks forward, yes, that is an anterior atlas, right? If it tracks back, 100% posterior. If your convergence angles are at odds at each other at 90 degrees, then 100% laterality will happen when they track. See what I'm saying? The average convergence angle is 18 to 33 degrees, meaning when that atlas misaligns, the majority of the trajectory will be in the A to P plane, right? The minority will be in laterality and rotation. The majority will be in A to P. Now, what you do with that information is up to you. I just happen to think it's interesting information, right? And so I'll leave it at that. But that kind of, I guess that's a super analytical look into that concept of torque twist 3D. But it's sort of like understanding that it moves that way. And then how do you measure that? How do you view the misalignment if that's happening? Those are all extrapolations of the reality of these. And that's why White and Punjabi called it the most complex articulations in the axial spine. And I think in the body, because of this, they're really, really quite dynamic.
I got to say something. I love this conversation, and I get more and more excited that we're discussing this kind of thing at Mile High. And like you said, like, oh, I could talk about this all day. I don't know about tonal. I'd love to learn about this. I had this experience, and I get excited hearing about this because I live in a particular analysis technique world, and don't spend as much time learning Gonstead. I did at some point and haven't, and people do this in life. You get into a certain area of specificity in terms of your life, a specification or focus, right? In what could be chiropractic, it could be in cooking, right? So, but here's the thing. I had this experience, you'll love this, that I had this experience that a person came to our office randomly, and he said he wanted to sell paper chiropractic face paper. I said, where do you get your paper from? And why do you get it from that company? How about you get it from someone who's local rather than a big company and someone will actually deliver it to you? I said, that sounds great. And he started a conversation. I actually started to talk to this guy for like an hour. He was an older gentleman, and he had been a chiropractic supplier for like 40 years or something like that. And he had met BJ Palmer when he had spoken in Colorado, like a long time ago, whatever number of years it was. He had, he was the supplier for the Spears Hospital. I'm sure you know chiropractic. They were his account. He did all the supplies for them back then. I was like, this is just fascinating. I just listened to him tell stories. And I said, what is your experience of the difference of chiropractors then and now? I asked him. And he said, chiropractors would sit and talk about analysis and subluxation and how to adjust people and about innate intelligence for hours in conversation. They would talk about different ways, and you would hear them go on and on with such passion and energy. And he said, and then they stopped doing that, and they would just talk about ways to make money.
Oh man, that's so good.
And so when I heard you, and I could hear the, like in me, like, oh, this is so interesting, so exciting. I thought of that experience. That's the experience I want to have at Mile High, that people are like, I get like conversations in the bar about that, about innate and about chiropractic. And wait, you do this with the person? Like, tell me about that. Because at the end of the day, we're all on this mission together. We want chiropractic to expand. We want people to get the best from us in our communities. And if I can learn a little bit more about the upper cervical spine, that's going to just make me better at serving people.
Amen.
And so I think it's going to be very exciting. So, And
love it.
Important. We've lost that in the profession, in parts of the profession. We've lost in parts of it are, I think there's a rebirth happening.
Amen.
So other question, another three-dimensional question. Okay. And I don't know the Blair position on this. Or thing, chiropractic, BJ Palmer introduced another thing that was an additional dimension to chiropractic analysis that wasn't there before, that was new, right? It was a novel concept in analysis, which was this new dimension of adding timing, right? And before, timing was not a factor, that was something that he brought to the profession, which was really a brilliant concept, right? What can you say about timing and analysis, and maybe specifically around Blair?
So when you say timing, do you mean when to adjust, when not to adjust?
Right. That there's a when and the one not to, and that there's pattern. Like that's timing.
Yeah, because I know BJ, I didn't know if you were talking about where BJ would talk about like in the adjustment, when to actually contract and make the adjustment, like by feel, all that stuff. But yeah, when to adjust and when not to adjust, and pattern analysis.
There's a time not to adjust, and there's a time to. Just that concept was novel and a complete departure from before.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's kind of like, again, it goes to how you do one thing is how you do everything. So BJ he measured everything, right? I mean, he just was like a savant or something, like just measuring everything you can possibly measure, right? And finding out when there's a subluxation, when there's not a subluxation, when to adjust, when not to adjust. And so part of my presentation goes into kind of it's called a generational look at the development of upper cervical. So looking at the different generations of techniques and how they came to be, right? And so Blair is really a downstream from BJ, right? Bill Blair graduated at a time when BJ was teaching side posture, upper cervical, very much already ingrained in the pattern work, and also looking at asymmetries and malformations and how that might violate your standard listing analysis, right? Mm-hmm. And so we absolutely do pattern analysis. I think it's extremely important. I love pattern analysis because it's congruent to chiropractic philosophy, right? And if we step back, and I'll probably mention this at Mile High if someone else doesn't, but to give credit and to pay homage to the late, great Dr. Andy Roberts. He kind of like created a new illustration for chiropractic, right? We used to have the three-legged stool. The problem is we're replacing legs. You know what I mean? We're taking out philosophy and we're putting in something else, and it's still a stool, right? We're still calling it chiropractic, even though we're bastardizing it and we're changing the way it's built, right? Where Andy would say that chiropractic was more like a tree, where the roots are your philosophy, right? The tree is the science. It's kind of what wells up from your philosophy. What do you choose to study? How do you study it? And then the fruit of that study is your technique, right? And so when we look at pattern analysis, I feel like it is very much congruent, going back to the science and then to the philosophy of the idea that the body is ultimately the most intelligent person in the room. The innate intelligence within the patient is the thing that's the most intelligent, right? And if it is, then we have to see, is it expressing itself more fully? And the only really way to do that is to measure adaptability, right? Because we could measure symptoms, but how do you know if it's good symptoms or bad symptoms? Is the body trying to heal, or is it stuck in a subluxated state? You know what I mean? Is that headache because they're subluxated, or is it because of dehydrated? Like, we have to differentiate that stuff. And we can start studying all these things. And one of the only measurable signs of intelligent life is adaptability. And so then pattern analysis is a way that you can apply this concept of subluxation physiology, which is to say, am I seeing a lack of adaptation in this patient? And so that in the Blair world is done through thermal pattern work, right? So BJ would do the wired instruments, like the neurocalometer. What am I trying to say here? The filaments there. But we use the Titron. That's the most modern tech in looking at thermal pattern asymmetries in the spine over time. We do that with everybody. We do some leg checks, both static leg checks and functional kind of muscle reactive leg checks, things like that, to determine when to adjust, when not, and to see how well the adjustment has taken. And I think it's priceless. I'll give you one quick story, and then I don't know if I've clarified or answered the question you're asking, but a story that goes along with all this was a gentleman with trigeminal neuralgia, right? Not James Tomasi, like I mentioned before, but this other guy, I got him adjusted. He came back in for his first follow-up, and he literally fell on the ground. Like, he kind of crumpled. He walked into my room and then just crumpled down, was holding the back of his neck and writhing in pain, which, first of all, from a practice management standpoint, was freaking me out as a new grad. I'm like, what the heck, you know? And he got up because he was having a TN attack. And he got up and then he pulled his hand off his neck and he had an ice pack on his neck. Because I had told him, maybe if you ever flare up brainstem, you could try. I always try and give people something they can do to manage in between their visits if they need it. We can get into that conversation. Maybe that's allopathic of me, who knows? But he had ice on his neck. And so now I can't even do my pattern analysis, my thermal, right? So then I do a leg check and I go through the protocols. He's totally clear, adaptive, he's doing well. But I had to tell a guy who literally just got done having one of the most painful neurological attacks a person on this planet can have, you're doing okay. Like, what we did last time is staying put. And if I adjust you right now, it'd be like taking a cast off a broken arm and moving it around and putting the cast back on, right? So, but my point is, I couldn't have that conversation if I didn't at least measure something. You know what I mean? If I was going off of symptoms, I would have, of course, adjusted him because he just had a freaking attack. And so to me, it's so valuable because, number one, it's congruent. And number two, it's hugely valuable for these really complex cases. Like, I think you can get away with it with standard cases that just are, I don't know, they got a sore back. I don't know. But with the weird, bizarre, complex, super subluxated people, you've got to know your timing. You really do. Otherwise, you just lose control of that patient. You know what I mean? And there'll be one of those many people that say, oh, I tried chiropractic. You know what I mean? It didn't work for me. It's like, oh, come on now. No, you know what I mean? Like, so anyhow, I think timing's important. We use it. And that's kind of a story as to why.
You know, I'll tell you something. Sherman College, obviously people know I'm a fan.
Shout out to Sherman. Yeah. I like them too.
Sherman College, it's often known for the philosophy and LACVS and objective. And people herald it's about, that we focus the objective is correcting subluxations and we bang that drum. Being a graduate of Sherman as an alum, I'll tell you the other thing that I don't think that's the only thing that makes Sherman unique or stand out. I also don't think it's only the upper cervical, because they had an upper cervical focus, and you could say that the essence of the Sherman package or the Sherman analysis that I think is vital is that this concept of analyzing the spine and nerve system is it to see is the person static or dynamic. Yeah. And that concept, it's not a concept, it's a principle, it's a physiological principle, right? Is a vital to chiropractic philosophy, science, and art. And enough people do not learn that.
Yeah,
period. And you can apply that principle and not just in the upper cervical, you can apply it in other chiropractic technique paradigms. And Sherman does that well because we had to pattern people out. And before we could do a first adjustment, they had to have at least 3 visits, and then you had to show pattern again. And that is something is vital as a chiropractic art principle, static or dynamic, that people don't value and learn enough because they learn chiropractic sadly a lot as a physical therapeutics as compared to chiropractic.
Yep, that's it. That's awesome. I agree.
And so, and this is where those conversations will help people be a better chiropractor.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful you're sharing that at
Absolutely.
Mile High.
Absolutely. We'll definitely be doing that.
Yeah. So, hey, last thing, can you say a little bit briefly about what the Upper Cervical Council and the Upper Cervical Diplomate Program are, so people that want to learn more after this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like anything in chiropractic, there's different technique systems that we're going to be learning at Mile High and going over, right? And so in the upper cervical world, we kind of identify upper cervical techniques as those things. And this is not officially, this is just me just talking. In general, as a profession, we probably identify upper cervical techniques as those techniques that are relatively exclusive to the upper cervical area. They usually involve some level of radiographic imaging, and they usually involve segmental adjusting. But it's not, I mean, you have the whole orthogonal world that is looking at realigning the whole structure, but you're looking at the skull, C1 and C2 primarily. And with the orthos, you're looking at like the lower neck as well, but we're balancing and looking at the whole spine. But my point is, in that definition of upper cervical, you have probably about, at this point, 6 to 8, maybe more technique organizations that have board certifications and trainings and all of that. And some time ago, Jerry Klum from Life West, Sean Dill, and Julie Mayer Hunt, Stan Pierce, Senior and Junior, BJ Kale, I think, was there, Tom Forrest, like these technique heads all got together out at Life West area and said that upper cervical needs to form a council to bring it together. And what's funny is BJ Palmer actually talked with a guy, I'm drawing a blank, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, crazy, but the real godfather of the orthogonal approaches was a guy out of California. I'm still trying to remember his name, I can't believe I'm forgetting it, but BJ even talked about it, that there needs to be one central place for communication. And BJ was talking about chiropractic at large back in the day, because when we divide, it causes confusion, right? So if you say that the atlas side slips and I say it wedges, or I say it does this or that, it confuses the public. Like it might be the same thing that we're doing, but we're using different words for it. And there's confusion in that. And so when BJ died and the upper cervical branches went apart, that has only been going on. And your Mile High coming up, bringing techniques, is kind of what the council was trying to do 10 years ago with upper cervical, which is bring them back to the table, because we're crying out loud, we're doing almost the exact same thing, especially in upper cervical, right? And so that formed, and that was the birthplace for the holding place for the Diplomate Program. And so the Diplomate Program is a 3-year, 300-hour program that while you're in the program, you get certified in one of those different upper cervical techniques. So you have to be certified in an upper cervical technique to even sit for the final board exam for the Diplomate. But then through the Diplomate Program, you're exposed to all the different techniques, right? All the different upper cervical techniques, sort of like you're exposing everybody to these regions of chiropractic techniques. It's just niched down to upper cervical, where you're really gaining and learning. And it's an amazing experience. It really is. When you got, again, in 3 years, you travel 9 or 10 weekends a year. It costs, I think the sum total over 3 years is something like 10 grand. So when you're putting yourself in a room with people that have that kind of time and money to invest in themselves and their practice, you're surrounding yourself with really high caliber individuals that just the growth curve is exponential. It really was a game changer for me. And so we're in our third Diplomate class. It's about halfway through. Our fourth class will probably start next fall. I think 2022 is what we're looking at right now. And if anyone's interested, they go to icauppercervical.com and they can look into more of that. And if they have any questions, of course, they can reach out to me.
Yeah, well, I thank you so much for sharing all of that. Again, it's something that, as someone who's dedicated their heart and soul to chiropractic when they became a DC, and they're dedicated to the principles of the philosophy, science, and art, us all having the conversations of upping our skill sets and knowledge of what we do with these, like every day, is something that I would think people would be, this is where I want to put my time and energy to, along with studying the philosophy and the science, right?
Yep.
So, but understanding more about the art, because then maybe our surface level knowledge that we learn in school, right?
Yep.
So I'm grateful that you're doing that. I highly recommend people learn more about Blair, pattern work, upper cervical, check out the Diplomate Program. I know those things were crucial to me in my development as a chiropractor. There's still things are foundational to what I do every single day. And most people don't necessarily do that. They learn, sadly, this surface level of chiropractic is popping a joint, and that's not chiropractic. There's so much more to it.
That's right.
But just it's like it's a rawest, crudest form.
Sure.
So we could say. So thank you for doing that. And how do people get in touch with you more, Ian?
So the best, honestly, I'm on most social media platforms at Dr. Ian Bulow, at Dr. Ian Bulow. That's probably the best thing I could say. Clinically, we're north of Pittsburgh, 20 minutes, and that's reviveucc.com. That's the clinic there. And we're happy to help any way. I'm happy to help any way I can.
Great. And we look forward to seeing you at Mile High. You'll be doing a mainstay session and a breakout session to learn more, which will really be helpful to people. And if you have not reserved your seat yet, milehighchiroregistration.com. In September, we shifted the date, make it more possible for everybody to be there. And we look forward to having you there. Hey, everyone, keep changing spines and lives and minds with chiropractic.